everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So as we continue here on our unit on the law and you, we're going to start talking about the largest law in the land, the top of the mountain, the Supreme Court. Specifically, we're going to spend a few lessons here talking about some of the most influential Supreme Court cases and how they have not only influenced society and the functioning of our government, but how they also reflect society and our changing views and ideals over time through the decisions of the Supreme Court. So today specifically, we're going to start talking about kind of how the Supreme Court got its start, where did it get its power from, and then how some of their earliest initial rulings really strengthened the power of the federal government, kind of how we see it today. Cool stuff to talk about. Let's get started. All right, landmark Supreme Court cases. So whether it's civil law or constitutional law or these other aspects, the outcomes of cases can keep getting appealed all the way to the top until you get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court they can take a case and listen to it and make a ruling based on does it violate the Constitution and make their ruling, and they basically set a precedent for how all law should follow after that, and the Supreme Court has the authority to call law unconstitutional and throw it out based on what the court case is saying. They don't take all cases. Most cases they're not going to hear, but the ones that they do, the reason they hear the cases that they do is because they are very influential cases, and by interpreting those cases and the experiences of people in the United States compared against what the rights are in the Constitution, all right, and what is allowed in the Constitution, they are able to clarify laws and really shape our society to what we have today. So that might be a whole lot of words. You're like, what are you talking about? Let's just jump into them, all right? And we got three that we're going to talk about today. The three court cases that we're going to talk about today are incredibly important, kind of on a macro scale. A lot of the court cases we're going to talk about are individual people and what their experiences were and how they symbolize issues and struggles and inequalities in the American society and how the Supreme Court interprets and adjusts that over time. Today, it's more on what is the role of the Supreme Court. It's kind of weird that the Supreme Court kind of got to define what their role is in the government. The legislative branch didn't get to do that. The executive branch didn't get to do that. The judicial branch, specifically the Supreme Court, does get to formulate what their role is in our government. And that kind of brings us to the first case here. So if you've been with me, we've talked about Marbury v. Madison. Marbury v. Madison. So I'm not going to go through the whole story again, as we haven't mentioned, but I'm going to give you enough that you need to know. All right. So there's this dude Marbury and his dude named Madison in 1803, and they got beef with each other. Now, you might be thinking, because I'm sure this is the first thing you're thinking, like, wait a minute. Didn't George Washington become president in 1789? And this court case, which I am sure Mr. Wagstaff is going to talk about how incredibly important it is to establish something that I'm sure all other court cases will be based off of, you would be correct on all of that. So what happened between 1789 and 1803? Was there not like anybody here, like were they not have any Supreme Court cases? Pretty much no. They didn't. Between 1789 and 1883, they had four. And they're not worth talking about. And here's why 1803 is important and why there's going to be a fundamental change in 1803 for the Supreme Court. 1789, George Washington becomes the president. He's elected. He asked this dude, John Jay, to be his Chief Justice. All right. First off, he asked John Jay, hey, I want you to be the Secretary of State. And John Jay's like, I don't want to do that. That seems like a lot of work. And he's like, oh, okay, I won't be Secretary of State. Will you be the Chief Justice? Like, will you be the head of the Supreme Court? And he's like, do I have to do anything? And George Washington's like, not really. And he's like, sure, cool. So this dude, John Jay, who plays a big role in Jay's Treaty and other stuff that is Stories for American History. He serves as the Chief Justice all through the 1790s. All right. In the early 1800s, he doesn't want to keep doing it, and just says, "I'm done. I don't want to be in charge of the Supreme Court anymore." So he leaves. Then there's this dude that's going to show up, and we're going to talk a bunch about him today. His name is John Marshall. Get used to that name today, because we're going to talk about John Marshall a bunch. John Marshall is the guy that's going to replace John Jay as the Supreme Court Justice. John Marshall, he feels very differently about the role of the Supreme Court. He doesn't think the Supreme Court should sit back and not do anything. He thinks that the Supreme Court's job should be much larger. He is also a Federalist, which means that he supports like George Washington's ideas and the early Federalist of a strong central government. Almost every ruling, when I say almost, every single ruling that John Marshall makes as a Supreme Court Justice is going to give the federal government more power. All right? He is all about having a strong central government that can help the people. All right? So it is called the Marshall Court, and we'll reference it quite a bit today. So you're like, but Mr. Wagstaff, the two names you got on the screen say Marbury v. Madison. Marshall isn't even there. That's right. Because like Marbury v. Madison, these are the two dudes that are suing each other, and they're the ones in conflict with each other. And John Marshall is the head of he's not the only Supreme Court Justice, but he's the top guy there. And he basically kind of formulates how things are going to run at the Supreme Court, what cases they choose and things like that. So he's the big guy in charge. Marbury v. Madison is one of the very first cases that John Marshall, the Chief Justice, is going to hear. Now, here's what the debate is, and if you may have remembered this from our previous lesson when we were talking about the Constitution. Marbury thought he was supposed to be a judge. Madison, who was supposed to give him a letter from John Adams, and doesn't. He's like, no, Thomas Jefferson doesn't want you to be a judge. You can't. Marbury's like, you have to give me my judge papers. And Marbury sues Madison. It goes to the Supreme Court. Marbury's like, the last president said I get to be a judge. You have to honor that. And Madison's like, no, I don't. And they're like, John Marshall, what do you think? And John Marshall's like, yes. I don't want to make him out to be like an evil villain, but he's like, yes, yes. Absolute power grab right here. When I mean power grab, this is usually really bad in government. When somebody's like, oh, there's more power. I have more power now, and I'm giving that power to me, to the Supreme Court. This is exactly what happens. John Marshall says, you know what? We'll say, Madison, you win. Like, you know, he picks a guy, you win. But from now on, the Supreme Court gets the power of judicial review. Like, this is in the ruling. It doesn't seem to have a whole lot to do with the case, but it basically says, it doesn't basically say, it does say, the Supreme Court now has the authority to decide if something is constitutional or not, meaning they can override the legislative and executive branch if it makes it to them, and they can point to the Constitution and say it is wrong from the Constitution, it is wrong here. This gives them like massive power, stuff that old John Jay didn't have the previous 15 years. The Marbury v. Madison is wildly important because it gives the Supreme Court judicial review. They're the referee on laws. They're the ones that can decide whether or not a law is constitutional, if they can throw it out or not. Here's a little cartoon here. It's supposed to be John Marshall. It's like, I wish for the power to declare laws unconstitutional to a genie. And the genie's like, why waste the wish on something you can grant yourself? Because that's what John Marshall does. He says, I now have ultimate authority for laws, or the Supreme Court does. And this seems wildly inappropriate. Basically, any other time in any other country when a branch of government just says, we have more power now. But honestly, once this happens, it's probably caught everybody off guard. Like Thomas Jefferson was the president when this happened. He's like, oh, wait, that's not good. What? Huh? Actually, I mean, we do need somebody to be the final say-so here, because we've already had issues with stuff like the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, other stuff that it's covered in U.S. history. We've had some issues. There needs to be somebody with the final say-so. And the Supreme Court makes the most sense for it. So judicial review comes out of Marbury v. Madison. It is massively important because the Supreme Court now, because all the other court cases we're going to talk about don't exist if the Supreme Court doesn't have the authority to decide like who's right and who's wrong based on the Constitution. So the judicial review, the Supreme Court gives themselves after Marbury v. Madison. I think Madison wins the case, but it doesn't really matter. The lasting impact is the random thing that John Marshall gives himself, which is judicial review, which really allows a branch of the government to have a final say-so over a law's constitutionality, because everything is based off the Constitution. So the question here is, why did Marbury v. Madison, what did it grant to the Supreme Court, and why is that so massively important? So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right, McCulloch v. Maryland. Let's see if I can make this complex case very influential case, because there's an issue that happens with Marbury v. Madison, I keep saying it, McCulloch v. Maryland, that was happening at the time, and the Marshall Court's going to step in. John Marshall, still in charge here when this happens, and this will be 16 years later. And he's going to make a ruling here that stops something from happening that we don't see today, which could absolutely be an issue. Let me just tell you what happens here with this story, all right? All starts with McCulloch v. Maryland. All right, I can't church it up too much. Let's deal with the National Bank. Now, here's what happens. Try to simplify this as much as I can. Revolutionary War, we beat Britain. France gives us a bunch of money. We have to pay them back. Well, as soon as we created our new government, we had to find a way to pay back England. So one of the ways that we're going to do that is tax people, because that's how the government gets money. Well, once we started taxing people, and the head of the Treasury under George Washington, the very first president, is a guy named Alexander Hamilton. As soon as he gets all this money, he's like, oh, cool. We have like $3 million. You know what would be better than $3 million? $5 million. So Alexander Hamilton decides to create a national bank, which means when everybody pays him tax money, instead of just paying off our debt, he takes that money and puts it in a bank controlled by the federal government. The reason that's important is because banks make a bankload of money. All right, banks make a lot of money. Do you know how banks make money? Well, very simply, banks take the money you deposit, all right, and in Alexander Hamilton's case, taxpayers' money, and then they give that money away to other people. Not necessarily give it away, they sell it to other people. They give them loans that people have to pay back plus interest. So banks take other people's money, and then they sell it to these people who give it back to them plus interest. It's an easy way to make money. Hooray. Now, what ends up happening, and there's a controversy over the National Bank, because immediately when the National Bank is made, it becomes the largest bank in America. People are still very concerned about having too strong of a federal government, but now you have the federal government, like on day 3 of its existence, has the most powerful bank in America, and money talks. So having the National Bank being so rich concerns people that it makes the federal government too powerful. All right? So really at this point, all you need to know in this story is that there is a national bank. It's very powerful because it has a bunch of money, and not everybody likes it. Brings us to Maryland. The state of Maryland decides, all right, cool idea then. If the federal government can make a federal bank, we're going to make the Maryland State Bank. And Maryland's like, we're going to have our own bank. And they're going to do the exact same thing that the federal government is, because federalism says, there's not federal government, state governments, one's above the other. Who knows? Loose constructionist concepts of Alexander Hamilton doesn't really say what you can or can't do. So they're kind of both existing here. It probably could have continued, but the state of Maryland starts doing something that, let's be honest, everybody knew that this was going to upset the federal government. The state of Maryland, their state bank, started taxing any bank that existed inside Maryland that wasn't owned by Maryland, including the National Bank. So Maryland starts taxing the federal bank. So the name of this court case is McCulloch v. Maryland. So I tried to find a picture of the guy named McCulloch. This is a real person, but he's so low level, not even such a famous court case, couldn't even find a picture of him. So James McCulloch, he just happens to be the dude that works at the local branch of the federal bank in Baltimore, which is in Maryland. So there's a federal bank in Maryland, and I guess the state of Maryland comes up to him and says, all right, since you represent the federal bank, pay us our, the taxes that you owe us. And he's like, no, I'm not going to pay you because I don't think that's cool. I don't think you can tax the federal government. And the state of Maryland's like, oh, you want to bet? And when James McCulloch, who represents the federal bank, refuses to pay these taxes, the state of Maryland files a lawsuit against James McCulloch, actually him. So he represents the federal bank. So it's not just like to him personally. He's not the one that has to pay the taxes. He just has to give access to the taxes. Keep in mind, the taxes that they're asking James McCulloch to pay are from the federal bank, which is made up of taxpayer money. So they're basically taxing that's the argument. It gets confusing really quick. Is this right or wrong? Because they're like, oh, you're taxing taxpayers. Is that bad? Is it federal banks and state banks? Is that even legitimate? Who knows? So let's take it to the Supreme Court, and it comes to the Marshall Court. Now, I've already mentioned this, and it's not really a spoiler because it's just something you need to know. When you ask John Marshall, hey, John Marshall, who should win, person A or person B? And he's like, which one gives the federal government more power? And whichever one that is, that's who's going to win. So who do you think would which side is he going to side with here that's going to give the federal government more power? James McCulloch, who represents the federal bank, or the state of Maryland? Well, the correct answer is he's clearly going to side with James McCulloch and the federal bank. And here's what he says. He says in the Constitution, and when I say he, this is Chief Justice John Marshall who makes this decision. He says, it is absolutely that the federal bank does not have to pay taxes. He says, not only that, there's this whole controversy over should the federal bank even exist? Yeah, it can, because the federal government wants it to happen. He's super pro-federal government. He says, the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution, which is also known as the elastic clause, because it can change, says that the rights and abilities of the federal government can change over time to meet the needs of the people. If the federal government decides that a national bank is necessary to meet the needs of the people, the federal government absolutely has the right to create a national bank. So that is, boom, thumbs up, constitutional, which is good for the federal government. You can have your federal bank. Now, as far as this thing on taxes go, all right, the state government cannot tax the federal government. You just can't do it, all right? He's like, you can't tax them. He's actually says the federal government, you can't really tax the states either. There's more wiggle room on that one. But he's like, the state governments cannot tax the federal government. And here's his famous quote that he is going to give here, because he cites federalism, supremacy clause with the federal government's over, elastic clause that gives the federal government more ability to decide what they want to do, in this case, create a federal bank, and then implied powers, just things that the federal government has. Those are all his reasons for decisions to be against Maryland, but he makes a very important statement here. He says the power to tax is the power to destroy. If you have the ability to tax somebody, you have the ability to destroy them. That's scary. And he admits it. He's like, so we got to be real careful on who we allow to tax. He thinks the federal government, which is elected by the people, should be the one that does the taxing. And the state governments can tax their own people because you all have say so, but states can't tax other states and things like that. But he really talks a lot about the implied powers here, the elastic clause, the supremacy clause. So basically he says at the end of the day with the implied powers, if the federal government believes that they need the power to do something that benefits the American people as a whole, they have a right to do that. And that's what brings us to the question of what are the implied powers and how does that help the Supreme Court rule that a national bank is constitutional? Because it is the power of the federal government has the authority to decide what is best for the people. If the federal government decides that having a bank is what's best for the American people as a whole, they have a right to do that under the concept of the implied powers. So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right, Gibbons V Ogden. All right. So while McCulloch v. Maryland is really important because it basically says the states can't tax the federal government. All right. And makes the supremacy that the federal government's over the states. That's a big part of that. Gibbons v. Ogden, there's a situation, again, still the John Marshall Court, all right? Here's what happens. Let's just jump into this one. This really isn't an issue today because of this court ruling. Gibbons v. Ogden, basically there's two guys. There's a guy named Thomas Gibbons and a guy named Aaron Ogden, all right? So Aaron Ogden is a ship captain, all right, who navigates the waters around the state of New York. Thomas Gibbons is a ship captain who navigates the waters around New York. Aaron Ogden, he has sole rights to use his ship in those waters. Nobody else can. He has a license. It says only he can do it. Thomas Gibbons, he's the only one that's allowed in those waters. He also has a license that says he's the only one that can operate in those waters. And you're like, what? Who would give out two of the identical licenses and say, like, each one of you guys are the only ones that can operate there? Well, the federal government, all right, gave it to Thomas Gibbons. The state of New York gave it to Aaron Ogden. Aaron Ogden says Thomas Gibbons can't operate because Aaron Ogden is the only one that has a license from the state of New York. Thomas Gibbons says, nah, man, I got a license here from the federal government that says I'm the only one that's allowed to operate here, so you can't do this. So these two guys are upset over this, and they sue each other over who gets the right to control these waters. Well, it goes to the Marshall Court. Based on what we've talked about today, you know how this turns out. Who's going to win? The federal government. The guy that wants is Thomas Gibbons. He's the guy from the federal government. Gibbons is going to win. All right. So the Marshall Court's like, so I see we have a discrepancy over who is stronger when it comes to shipping and trade and commerce, which is just a fancy word for trade, between states, all right, because they're going across to different states with New Jersey and stuff like that. See, there's a discrepancy. Well, from now on, based on the Constitution, the federal government is the only one that can regulate trade between states. All right. States can't regulate trade with other states. States have the right to regulate trade inside their own state. If you're going from one city to the next, states have at it. That's fine. But the moment you try to trade, and that's what these water licenses were of transferring goods from one state to another, when it's interstate trade, the federal government gets the final say-so in this. And you know, it's, again, this seems like a power grab. Chief Justice John Marshall don't care about anything. He's going to give all the power to the federal government all the time, which, yes, he does that. But looking at this, had it gone the other way, our society would have been drastically different. Because by giving the power to the federal government, it kind of forces all the states to be equal. And the federal government can treat each state equally. If the states had won this and they could manage their own trade how they wanted to, rich states could abuse poor states. It could basically make, like, instead of being like the United States of America, each state would be like their own country and desperately, getting embargoes put on them from other states and all this other stuff. The Marshall Court says, nah. And they use the Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824. All right. They use this one as the example. All right. Glad you brought this to our attention since we have you here. the federal government makes all the rules with interstate trade in between different states. So the whole idea here is you let all the states grow individually or as a whole, and you don't let one state regulate another state, or you're just in for a world of hurt, because then your rich states can really abuse your poorer states and kind of create this hierarchy of the states that have some and some that don't. So the question here is, why is it important that the government have the ability to regulate commerce or trade? And by the government, I mean the federal government. How could this be a problem if the states had control? And we had just talked about that. So pause me, answer this in complete sentences. Our future questions that we're going to have, or Supreme Court cases, are going to be very different than this. These are very broad concepts. Like we don't talk about Ogden and all this other stuff. From here on, it gets very specific, individual, and these are really important, but you'll see how they build as we go further into these lessons. All right, that's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you tomorrow.